Hey everyone, and welcome back to another deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today we're tackling a topic that is, well, it's pretty heavy.
Yeah, it's
We're going inside Syria's Saydnaya military prison,
right.
and we've got a variety of sources to pull from for this one.
Absolutely.
We've got this YouTube video featuring interviews with survivors,
Yeah.
a pretty in-depth report from Amnesty International,
Mm.
and even some pretty chilling Wikipedia entries.
Right.
So yeah,
Heavy stuff.
heavy stuff, but that's what we do here.
It
To
is.
dive deep.
Yeah.
And for this one, I think our mission is to kind of try to really understand,
Right.
what went on inside Saydnaya,
Right.
and more importantly, what it reveals about the Syrian regime.
Thank God it's not just about one prison.
Right.
Saydnaya, which is located just north of Damascus,
Okay.
has become infamous as a symbol of the larger crackdown on dissent in Syria.
Right.
And what's crucial to understand here is that after the 2011 uprising, Saydnaya kind of transformed from a standard military prison into a holding ground for anyone perceived as a threat to the government.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking thousands of people detained, often after sham trials,
Wow.
sometimes without even knowing the charges against them.
Okay, so we're already seeing a system designed to silence opposition,
Right.
but then it gets even darker.
Yeah.
The YouTube video features interviews with survivors,
Mm-hmm.
and they describe something they call a welcome ceremony for new arrivals.
Right.
It's horrifying, really.
Yeah, the term ceremony is incredibly deceptive.
Yeah.
This wasn't a ritual in any cultural sense, but a calculated act of brutality.
Right.
Survivors describe being stripped naked,
Wow.
beaten with whips,
Oh my.
sometimes 150, 200 lashes.
Wow.
They even talk about a torture position called the human meat grinder,
What?
forcing prisoners into this contorted posture for hours.
Oh my God.
Many didn't even survive this welcome.
It's hard to even fathom that level of cruelty.
Yeah.
It seems like something out of a history book.
Right.
Not the 21st century.
You would think.
But this Amnesty International report
Mm.
really emphasizes that torture wasn't about interrogation
Right.
or getting information out of these prisoners.
Exactly. Amnesty's findings are chilling.
Yeah.
Because they point to torture as a deliberate policy of dehumanization.
Wow.
The goal wasn't to extract confessions, but to break the individual's spirit,
Right.
to make them feel utterly powerless.
Mm-hmm.
And it went beyond physical pain.
Right.
Even visits from loved ones, which you might think would provide some solace,
Yeah.
were twisted into triggers for more beatings.
Oh my gosh.
Can you imagine the psychological impact of that?
No.
Families were denied any real contact,
Wow.
often told their loved one was dead when they were very much alive.
Jeez.
Just further amplifying the sense of isolation and despair.
It's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And speaking of those individual stories, the video features a former prisoner named Maisen Hamada,
Right.
whose story is both inspiring and utterly tragic.
Yeah. His case is particularly illuminating
Okay.
because it demonstrates how the regime targeted not just those actively involved in the uprising,
Okay.
but anyone who dared to speak out.
Right.
Maisen's initial arrest came after he participated in peaceful protests.
Wow.
He was blindfolded,
Jeez.
shuffled between detention centers, and eventually ended up in Saydnaya, much like countless others. And this is where we see the psychological torture you were talking about.
Right.
In the video, he describes this awful ritual surrounding food.
Oh.
They were starving, obviously,
Right.
and the guards would bring these meager rations,
Mhm.
but then pour boiling tea over everything,
Oh my God.
essentially ruining their only source of sustenance.
Wow.
It wasn't just about denying them food,
Right.
but about crushing their spirits, reminding them who was in control.
Precisely that constant degradation, that
Yeah.
arbitrary cruelty.
Yeah.
It was all part of a system designed to eliminate any sense of hope or resistance.
Right. What's remarkable about Maisen is that despite enduring this, he managed to escape.
Oh,
He made it to Holland and became an outspoken critic of the Assad regime.
good for him.
Sadly, that bravery came at a steep price.
His family was kidnapped by the regime,
Oh my gosh.
essentially held hostage to silence him.
Wow.
You can see the pain in his eyes in the video as he talks about being forced to return to Syria,
Oh,
knowing the danger he was facing.
and tragically, his story doesn't have a happy ending.
Oh,
Maisen refused to recant his testimonies.
wow.
And years later, his body was found bearing the undeniable marks of torture.
Oh, geez.
It's a stark reminder of the risks these survivors took and the lengths to which the regime would go to silence any form of dissent.
Wow.
But Mazen's story isn't unique.
Right.
The video also features testimonies from Omar al-Shagri and Bashar Weil,
Okay.
each with their own horrifying experiences.
Okay.
Maybe we can unpack those next.
Yeah, absolutely. These individual stories are what make this situation so real, so much more than just statistics. Absolutely.
But before we move on, I have to ask.
Sure.
The video mentions Saydnaya having multiple floors underground.
Yeah.
Do we have any sense of how big this place actually was?
It's truly staggering.
Yeah.
Based on satellite imagery and architectural analysis, Amnesty International believes there are at least 3 confirmed floors above ground and at least 3 below.
Wow.
There's even evidence suggesting there could be up to 7 underground levels,
Jeez.
creating this hidden labyrinth within the prison.
It's like something out of a dystopian novel.
Yeah.
And how many people could they have held in a place like that?
Based on their estimates, Saydnaya could have held as many as 100,000 prisoners.
Wow.
Though that's a rough figure given the secrecy surrounding the place.
Right.
What's even more chilling is that only a tiny fraction,
Yeah.
around 300 individuals, have been released since the start of the conflict.
Wow.
Recently released satellite images show the prison is still very much active,
Really?
suggesting thousands are still trapped inside, unaware of their country's liberation. It's hard to even wrap my head around that.
Yeah.
So we've talked about the physical prison, but the YouTube video also touches on something else really unsettling.
Okay.
The use of informants by the Syrian regime.
Right.
They call them Dababis or Shaba.
Right.
Can you explain what that was all about?
It's a chilling tactic.
Yeah.
These informants, often disguised as fellow protesters, infiltrated the demonstrations that erupted in 2011.
Wow.
They gathered information, identified leaders,
Oh my gosh.
and reported back to the regime.
So they were like spies.
Essentially, yes, creating this climate of paranoia and fear.
Right.
Imagine going to a protest not knowing if the person next to you was a genuine supporter
Yeah.
or someone working for the very forces you were protesting against.
It makes you wonder who you could trust.
Exactly.
No wonder people were so hesitant to speak out,
Right.
knowing that even within their own ranks, there could be eyes and ears for the regime.
Absolutely. It was a strategy designed to stifle dissent at its core. Knowing this makes the stories of survivors like Mazen even more remarkable.
Yeah.
They knew the risks, the potential for betrayal,
Yeah.
yet they still chose to raise their voices.
That takes incredible courage.
Absolutely.
And speaking of Omar and Bashar, whose stories are also featured in the video,
Right.
their experiences seem to reveal even more layers of this calculated cruelty within Saydnaya.
You're right. Omar, for example, was forced to make an impossible choice.
What was that?
Select a fellow prisoner for execution.
Oh my gosh.
Can you imagine the psychological trauma of that?
No.
And then he was subjected to solitary confinement,
What?
constantly taunted by guards,
Jeez.
asked how he wanted to die.
Oh gosh.
The mental torture, the erosion of his very humanity, it's almost beyond comprehension.
And Bashar, who went from participating in peaceful protests to delivering humanitarian aid,
Right.
only to be captured and thrown into this nightmare.
It's awful.
In the video, he describes witnessing a 13-year-old boy
Oh my.
being brought back to the cell after being sexually assaulted.
That's terrible.
It's just there are no words.
Their stories, while incredibly difficult to hear,
Yeah.
are crucial pieces of evidence in the fight for justice.
Right.
Amnesty International is actively campaigning for unrestricted access to Syria's prisons,
Okay.
demanding independent monitors be allowed in to investigate these crimes.
Right.
The world needs to know the truth about what happened,
Yeah.
and those responsible must be held accountable.
Absolutely. But beyond holding individuals accountable, what about preventing this from happening again?
Right?
I mean, how do we safeguard human rights?
Yeah.
Ensure that people can speak out without fear of ending up in a place like Saydnaya?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It
Yeah.
requires a multifaceted approach.
Okay.
We need to support organizations like Amnesty International that are working tirelessly to expose these abuses.
Mhm.
We need to raise awareness to keep these issues in the public eye and put pressure on governments to prioritize human rights in their foreign policy decisions.
So it's a global effort? We can't become desensitized to these stories.
Right.
They should shake us to our core.
Yeah.
Motivate us to fight for a better world. A world where such horrors are relegated to the history books.
I couldn't agree more. These atrocities can't be allowed to fade into obscurity.
Right.
We have a responsibility to remember, to learn, and to act.
Okay.
But what about the aftermath for those who were fortunate enough to survive Saydnaya?
Yeah.
The video briefly touches on their struggles after release.
Okay.
And it's clear the trauma doesn't just disappear when they walk out of those prison gates.
You're right. The video doesn't really delve into that aspect.
Yeah.
What kind of challenges do these survivors face?
It's multifaceted.
Okay.
They grapple with severe physical and psychological trauma.
Right.
Many suffer from PTSD,
Oh, what?
plagued by nightmares, flashbacks, and the constant fear of reprisal.
Yeah.
They often bear the physical scars of torture,
Yeah.
malnutrition, chronic pain, untreated injuries that continue to haunt them long after they're free.
It's almost like they're released from that physical prison, only to find themselves trapped in another one.
Right.
A prison of their own minds, their own bodies.
Exactly. And they desperately need access to comprehensive medical and psychological care.
Right.
Support systems for these survivors are often inadequate,
Oh.
leaving them to navigate the complex process of rebuilding their lives with limited resources and understanding.
It feels like a whole other layer of injustice. After enduring so much, they're left to grapple with the invisible wounds,
Right.
often alone and unsupported.
Yeah.
What can be done to help these survivors?
There are organizations dedicated to providing trauma-informed care and support services for survivors of torture,
Okay.
but their resources are often stretched thin.
Right.
We need to increase funding and support for these initiatives.
Okay.
Additionally, raising awareness about the long-term impact of torture is crucial to foster empathy and understanding within communities.
So it's about creating a space where survivors feel safe to share their stories, to access the help they need without shame or stigma.
Absolutely. And on a larger scale, advocating for policies that prioritize rehabilitation and reintegration of survivors into society is crucial.
Okay, so it's not just about holding perpetrators accountable,
Right.
but also about addressing the long-term consequences of these human rights violations.
Precisely, we need to approach this issue with a sense of compassion and a commitment to ensuring that survivors receive the support and resources they need to heal and rebuild their lives.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
The horrific conditions inside Saydnaya, the systematic use of torture, the psychological impact on survivors, even the role of informants in silencing dissent.
That's a lot to take in.
But before we wrap up, I'm curious about something else the YouTube video mentioned.
Okay.
The Tataman massacre.
Right.
It seemed like a whole other level of horror, even within the context of everything we've already discussed.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that?
It's another chilling example of the Syrian regime's brutality. While not directly related to Saydnaya, the Tataman massacre occurred in a Damascus suburb.
Okay.
During the early stages of the uprising,
Right.
the video describes a horrifying scene.
Yeah.
Civilians, including women and children, being rounded up, executed,
Oh my God.
dumped into mass graves.
Wow.
Some accounts even mention victims being fed to lions,
What?
crushed in metal presses, or even dissolved in acid in an attempt to erase all evidence.
It's just unimaginable.
It's horrifying.
The level of dehumanization, the sheer callousness, it's hard to believe this actually happened.
Unfortunately, there's strong evidence to suggest this was a very real event,
Right.
while the Syrian government has denied any involvement.
Of course.
Multiple sources, including eyewitness testimonies and leaked footage, corroborate the account of the massacre.
It's a stark reminder that the brutality we've discussed in the context of Saydnaya wasn't isolated.
Right.
It seems to have permeated many aspects of the regime's response to the uprising.
You're absolutely right. The Tataman massacre, like the atrocities within Saydnaya, points to a larger pattern of systemic violence and repression.
Right.
It underscores the urgency of holding those responsible accountable and working to prevent such horrors from ever happening again.
Okay, so we've talked about the brutality within Saydnaya, the scale of the prison system, the psychological impact on survivors, and even touched on the Tataman massacre as another example of the regime's cruelty.
Right.
But I'm curious, what about the people still trapped inside Saydnaya?
Yeah.
What happens to them?
It's a haunting question,
Yeah.
and one that underscores the ongoing tragedy unfolding in Syria. There's a chilling line in the Wikipedia article about Saydnaya
Okay.
that states, anyone who stays in this prison is destined to die.
Wow.
It's a stark and terrifying reality.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to remember that while focusing on the prison itself is important,
Right.
it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
What do you mean?
Well, the YouTube video also highlights a horrifying trend used by the regime during the uprising.
Okay.
The use of informants known as dababis or shabia.
Wait, hold on.
Yeah.
You're saying the video mentions informants attending the protests.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
These individuals pretended to be part of the opposition, even participating in demonstrations.
Jeez.
But their goal was to gather names and intel for the regime,
Wow.
identifying anyone who dared to speak out against the government.
That's terrifying.
It is.
It creates a sense of paranoia and distrust within the movement itself.
Right.
No wonder people were afraid to speak up.
Absolutely. The presence of these informants had a chilling effect on dissent,
Yeah.
making it incredibly difficult to organize and mobilize against the regime.
Wow.
It underscores the level of control and surveillance the Syrian government wielded over its citizens.
It makes the stories of the survivors we've been discussing even more remarkable.
It does.
They risked everything to stand up for what they believed in.
Yeah.
Knowing full well that they could be betrayed at any moment.
It's a testament to their courage and conviction.
It is.
There is a powerful quote from the Amnesty International report that captures the sentiment.
Okay.
It says, "They are targeted ruthlessly, but remain unable to confess to save themselves from further beatings.
Wow.
They knew they might not make it out alive, but they refused to be silenced."
Their testimonies, as painful as they are
Yeah,
vital pieces of evidence in the fight for justice.
they are.
The world needs to know what happened in those prisons,
Absolutely.
in those torture chambers.
It does.
And that's why Amnesty International's call for unrestricted access for independent monitors is so crucial.
It's essential.
These investigators need to be allowed into Syria's prisons to document the atrocities, to gather evidence,
Right.
and to help ensure that those responsible for these crimes are held accountable.
Exactly. But even beyond accountability, there's a larger question here.
What's up?
How do we prevent this from happening again? Not just in Syria, but anywhere in the world.
That's the ultimate challenge, isn't it?
It is.
How do we safeguard human rights?
Yeah.
How do we ensure that everyone has the right to speak their mind, to assemble peacefully, without fear of reprisal?
It's a complex issue.
Yeah.
That requires a multifaceted approach, both on a global and individual level.
You're right. It requires a global effort, a commitment to justice, and a refusal to look away when faced with atrocities.
Absolutely.
We need to strengthen international mechanisms for protecting human rights,
Right.
hold governments accountable for their actions, and support organizations working to promote peace and justice.
It's going to take all of us working together.
We can't allow ourselves to become desensitized to these stories.
Right.
They have to shake us to our core, to ignite a fire within us, to fight for a better world.
Yeah.
A world where these horrors are relegated to the history books.
Absolutely. We have responsibility to listen, to learn, and to act.
Wow.
We can't allow these atrocities to fade into obscurity. The memory of those who suffered, those who lost their lives in these prisons, demands that we never forget.
And what about those who were released from Saydnaya?
Yeah.
The YouTube video briefly mentions their struggles,
Right.
but doesn't delve very deep.
It doesn't.
What kind of challenges do these survivors face once they're free?
That's a crucial point and often an overlooked aspect of this issue.
Yeah.
Many of these survivors are dealing with severe physical and psychological trauma as a result of their experiences.
Right.
They often suffer from PTSD plagued by nightmares, flashbacks, and the constant fear of reprisal.
It's like they were released from that physical prison, but they're still trapped in a prison of their own mind.
Exactly. And the physical toll is immense as well. We're talking about malnutrition, chronic pain, untreated injuries, all things that continue to haunt them long after they're free.
Well,
They need access to comprehensive medical and psychological care to help them heal and rebuild their lives.
and are they getting that support?
Unfortunately, in many cases, no. Support systems for survivors of torture are often inadequate,
Wow.
leaving them to navigate the complex process of healing and reintegration with limited resources and understanding.
It seems like a whole other layer of injustice.
It is.
After enduring so much, they're left to grapple with these invisible wounds,
Right.
often alone and unsupported.
Yeah.
What can be done to help these survivors?
There are organizations doing incredible work to provide trauma-informed care and support services for survivors of torture,
Okay.
but their resources are often stretched thin and the need is immense.
Right.
We need to increase funding and support for these initiatives.
And what about on a policy level?
Yeah.
Is there anything governments can do to help these survivors?
Absolutely. We need to advocate for policies that prioritize the rehabilitation and reintegration of survivors into society.
Okay.
This includes things like providing access to healthcare, housing, education, and employment opportunities.
It sounds like a multifaceted approach is needed.
It is.
We need to address both the immediate needs of survivors and the systemic issues that make it so difficult for them to rebuild their lives.
Exactly. We need to approach this issue with a sense of compassion and a commitment to ensuring that survivors receive the support and resources they need to heal and thrive.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive,
Okay.
I want to revisit something you mentioned earlier.
Sure.
The haunting line from the Wikipedia article about Saydnaya,
Right.
stating that anyone who stays in this prison is destined to die.
Yeah,
That's a heavy statement.
it is.
What are your thoughts on that?
It's certainly a chilling thought, and while it's difficult to confirm the absolute veracity of that statement,
Right.
the evidence we have from survivors and human rights organizations paints a very grim picture.
Yeah.
The conditions within Saydnaya are designed to break people, both physically and mentally.
Right.
The combination of torture, starvation, disease, and psychological abuse
Yeah.
creates an environment where survival is a constant struggle.
It's almost like a death sentence in slow motion.
In a way, yes. And it's important to remember that this isn't just happening to individuals.
Right.
It's a systematic attempt to silence dissent, to crush any opposition to the Syrian regime.
It's a chilling reminder of the fragility of human rights
It is.
and the consequences of allowing those rights to be violated.
Absolutely. And it's not just a Syrian issue.
Right.
We've seen similar tactics used in other countries where authoritarian regimes seek to maintain their grip on power.
So what can we do?
Yeah.
How do we ensure that these horrors aren't repeated elsewhere?
It's a complex question and there's no easy answer.
Right.
But I think it starts with awareness.
Okay.
We need to educate ourselves about these issues to understand the root causes of conflict and human rights abuses.
And then what can we do with that knowledge?
We can support organizations working to promote human rights and democracy.
Okay.
We can hold our own governments accountable for their foreign policy decisions.
Right.
We can speak out against injustice even when it feels like our voices are small.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in building a more just and equitable world.
Exactly. And that's what makes these stories so important.
Right.
They serve as a reminder of what's at stake and the consequences of our inaction.
Okay, we've been talking about the horrifying conditions inside Saydnaya prison, the systematic torture, the heartbreaking stories of the survivors.
Right.
But there's one more thing I want to touch on before we wrap up.
Sure.
The YouTube video briefly discusses the challenges faced by those who were released from Saydnaya.
You're right. It's something that often gets overlooked.
Yeah.
Many of those who survive Saydnaya are dealing with the long-term consequences of their imprisonment,
Right.
both physically and emotionally.
Yeah.
They often suffer from PTSD nightmares, flashbacks. The scars of their experiences run deep.
It's like they were released from that physical prison, but they're still trapped in a prison of their own minds.
Precisely. And the physical toll is immense as well. We're
Yeah.
talking about malnutrition, chronic pain, untreated injuries.
Right.
They need access to comprehensive medical and psychological care to help them rebuild their lives.
So it's not just about getting them out of that physical prison,
Right.
but also about providing them with the support they need to cope with the lasting effects of their trauma.
Absolutely. And that support is often lacking.
Really?
Many survivors struggle to access adequate health care and mental health services.
Jeez.
They face stigma and discrimination, making it even harder to reintegrate into society.
It seems like a whole other layer of injustice.
It is.
After enduring so much, they're left to grapple with these invisible wounds,
Right.
often alone and unsupported.
Yeah.
What can be done to help these survivors?
There are organizations dedicated to providing trauma-informed care and support services for survivors of torture,
Okay.
but their resources are often stretched thin.
Right.
We need to increase funding and support for these initiatives.
And on a larger scale,
Yeah.
what can governments and policymakers do?
Advocating for policies that prioritize the rehabilitation and reintegration of survivors into society is crucial.
Okay.
This includes things like providing access to healthcare, housing, education, and employment opportunities.
It sounds like a multifaceted approach is needed.
It is.
We need to address both the immediate needs of survivors and the systemic issues that make it so difficult for them to rebuild their lives.
Exactly. We need to approach this issue with a sense of compassion and a commitment to ensuring that survivors receive the support and resources they need to heal and thrive.
You know, we've talked a lot about the systematic nature of the brutality in Saydnaya.
Right.
But the YouTube video also mentioned some truly gruesome details about how the regime allegedly disposed of bodies.
Yeah.
I mean, feeding bodies to lions, crushing them in metal presses, dissolving them in acid.
It's awful.
Sounds like something out of a horror movie.
It's hard to even process, isn't it?
Yeah.
And yet the evidence suggests these accounts are likely true.
Wow.
The regime seemed determined to erase any trace of their crimes. To make these victims disappear completely, it adds another layer of cruelty to the whole situation.
And it makes you wonder how many families were left with no answers.
Right.
No closure, just this agonizing uncertainty.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
The Wikipedia article even states that in many cases relatives were told their loved one had died, when in fact they were still being held at Saydnaya.
It's just awful.
That systematic denial of information.
Right.
The deliberate creation of fear and uncertainty. It was all part of the regime's strategy to control the population.
Absolutely.
Almost too much to bear.
It is.
And yet the Amnesty International report urges us to do just that, to bear witness, to confront the truth no matter how horrific.
Right.
What do you think they mean by that?
It's a good question.
What does it mean to truly bear witness in a situation like this?
I think it's about acknowledging the reality of what happened.
Right.
Refusing to turn away from the suffering, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us feel. It's about listening to the stories of survivors, amplifying their voices and demanding justice for the victims.
And I think it's also about understanding the larger context, the political and social forces that allowed these atrocities to happen.
Absolutely.
It's about learning from the past so we can work to prevent such horrors from ever happening again.
You have to try.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's not enough to simply condemn the perpetrators.
Right.
We need to examine the systems that allowed them to flourish, to hold those in power accountable, and to push for real lasting change.
It's a tall order, but it's necessary.
So as we conclude this deep dive into the dark heart of Syria's Saydnaya prison, I'm left with this feeling of heaviness, a sense of responsibility.
I understand.
It's clear we've only scratched the surface of a very complex and disturbing story.
We have, but even with the limited information we have, it's a story that demands our attention.
Absolutely.
It challenges us to confront the darkest aspects of humanity, to grapple with questions of justice, accountability, and our own role in shaping a more just and compassionate world.
What do you hope our listeners will take away from this deep dive?
I hope they'll leave with a deeper understanding of the human cost of conflict and repression.
Yeah.
I hope they'll feel a sense of responsibility to learn more, to speak out against injustice, to support those working to make a difference.
And most importantly, I hope they'll never forget the stories of those who suffered within those prison walls.
I agree. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by these kinds of stories.
Right.
To feel like there's nothing we can do as individuals.
Yeah.
But we can't allow ourselves to become complacent or indifferent.
You're right. Every voice matters.
Exactly. Even small acts of awareness, of compassion, of speaking truth to power can contribute to a larger movement for change. The fight for justice is a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
It requires sustained effort, but it's a fight worth having.
So to our listeners out there, we leave you with this. What will you do with the knowledge you've gained today?
It's a big question.
Will you allow these stories to fade into the background noise of the world?
Yeah.
Or will you allow them to fuel your passion for justice, to ignite a fire within you, to make a difference?
The choice is yours.
And with that, we conclude our deep dive into the heart of Saydnaya prison.